Welcome to Whispering Pages. If you're here tonight, you've already chosen something rare, to end your day with something that matters, without a screen stealing the light from your eyes. I'm so glad you're here. And I want you to know, tonight's book is different from anything we've covered before. It's not a business book. It's not a framework or a system. It's a life, fully lived, and then slowly, beautifully let go. It's one of the most important books written in the last decade. But before we step into it, let's take a moment just for you. Whatever this day held, the decisions, the conversations, the thousand small weights, you don't have to carry any of it into sleep. So let it go. All of it. Just for the next 30 minutes. Feel the weight of your body against your mattress. Notice how your pillow holds you, how you don't have to hold yourself upright anymore. Take a slow breath in through your nose. And let it go. One more time. In. And out. Let your shoulders drop. Soften your jaw. If there's tension across your forehead or behind your eyes, just let it ease. You're safe. You're still. And you are exactly where you need to be right now. Here's something worth knowing. The 30 minutes before sleep is one of the most powerful learning windows your brain has. As you settle toward rest, your mind becomes especially open to new ideas, and what you hear tonight consolidates into memory while you sleep. So you're not just winding down, you're doing something quietly profound. Tonight's book is called When Breath Becomes Air, written by Paul Kalanithi, published in 2016. Paul was a brilliant neurosurgeon, a man who spent his life studying how the brain gives rise to meaning, and who, at 36 years old, was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer. He wrote this book while dying, and in it, he asked the question that most of us spend our lives avoiding: what makes a life worth living? So let's begin. Get comfortable. Close your eyes if you'd like. And let's whisper through this one together. The book opens in a hospital room. A man is looking at a CT scan on a computer screen, lungs matted with tumors, spine deformed, liver nearly obliterated. He has seen hundreds of scans like this over his career. But this one is his own. That man is Paul Kalanithi. And the moment he describes, sitting in a hospital gown, his wife Lucy beside him, scrolling through images of his own dying body, is one of the most quietly devastating openings in all of modern literature. It's the first thing you read, and it sets the tone for everything that follows. This is a book about a man who spent his entire life preparing to face death, and who then had to face it himself. To understand why this matters so much, you have to understand who Paul was before the diagnosis. He grew up in Kingman, Arizona, a small town in the desert, not especially known for producing intellectuals, but Paul was different from the start. His mother, worried that her boys would have limited horizons in such an isolated place, stocked the house with books. And Paul read them all. He consumed literature the way other kids consumed television. He fell in love with language early and never fell out of it. He went to Stanford as an undergraduate, where he studied both English literature and human biology at the same time, a combination most people thought was eccentric, but which made perfect sense to him. He was trying to answer a single question that would haunt him his entire life. Where do biology and meaning meet? How does a lump of tissue, 3 pounds of neurons and synapses, give rise to the experience of being alive, of loving someone, of knowing you will die? After his undergraduate degree, he stayed at Stanford for a master's in English literature. He wrote his thesis on Walt Whitman, a poet who, a century before, had wrestled with the same obsession Paul carried: how to understand what Whitman called the physiological spiritual man. Paul was captivated by the idea that science and literature weren't opposites. They were two different vocabularies for understanding the same thing. But somewhere in those years, Paul came to a realization. Words alone weren't enough. He could study meaning all he wanted in books, could spend his life in a library parsing the language of existence, but at some point, he realized he needed to experience it directly. He needed to be present at the moments when life and death intersect. He needed to be there. He went to Cambridge to study the history and philosophy of science. He went to Yale for medical school. And then, slowly, he found his way to neurosurgery, the specialty that most directly engages the organ that makes us who we are. Neurosurgery is ferocious. The training is among the longest and most demanding of any medical specialty. 7 years of residency, easily 100 hours a week in the hospital, decisions made on zero sleep that permanently alter other people's lives. Paul describes the early years with extraordinary honesty. The first patient he lost, the first time he understood that his judgment could end someone's story. One of the most striking passages describes sitting with an 82-year-old woman at 8 in the evening, checking in before going home, crossing her name off his list. She died a few hours later. From that point forward, he writes, he resolved to treat every patient like a person rather than a piece of paperwork. He also writes about something that surprised him. He had gone into medicine, and specifically neurosurgery, believing that proximity to death would make him wise. That staring into the face of mortality every day would clarify things. And it did, eventually. But first, it numbed him. You adapt. You float. You develop a gallows humor with your colleagues that lets you keep functioning when the weight would otherwise be unbearable. His closest friend in residency, Jeff, died by suicide after a patient was lost. Paul's grief over Jeff carries through the book like a quiet undercurrent, a reminder that even the healers need healing. By the time Paul approached the end of his residency, he had become something remarkable, a surgeon whose hands were skilled enough to remove tumors from the language centers of awake patients while making small talk. A doctor who understood that his job wasn't just to save bodies, it was to help people answer the question of what kind of life was worth living. He had started fielding job offers from universities across the country. Stanford was quietly building a position specifically for him. He was 36 years old. The finish line was in sight. And then his back started hurting. The back pain arrived first. Then weight loss, his belt cinching 2 notches tighter over just a few weeks. Then night sweats, and then a cough that wouldn't go away. Paul knew, the way doctors always know, what the symptom cluster meant. He knew it on a medical board's exam in his 20s. Unexplained weight loss plus new back pain in a man in his 30s. The answer is cancer. But knowing it intellectually and accepting it emotionally are entirely different things. He mentions, with painful honesty, that his marriage was strained at exactly this moment. Lucy, herself a physician, had begun to feel that she was living alongside Paul more than with him. That the relentlessness of his training had left their relationship running on fumes. She asked for space. He went to New York to visit college friends, telling himself everything would be fine. By the time he returned, his symptoms had grown impossible to ignore. When the CT scan came back and Paul scrolled through the images himself, metastatic lung cancer, widespread, he lay in the hospital bed and held Lucy close. He told her to remarry after he was gone. He told her not to spend her whole life grieving. Then he asked a nurse about the mortgage. That's Paul. Even in the first hours of learning he is dying, the engineer in him is already making practical calculations. His oncologist was a woman named Emma, whom Paul had known professionally but never really talked with before. Their first meeting is one of the most quietly powerful scenes in the book. Paul, still a physician in his own mind, asks immediately to see his survival statistics, the Kaplan-Meier curves, which show survival probability over time. Emma refuses. Not coldly. She just says no, and tells him they can talk about treatment options, and whether he might want to return to work, and how they'll protect his hands from the nerve damage some chemotherapy can cause. Go back to work? Paul is stunned. But Emma's refusal to reduce him to a statistical projection was, he eventually understands, an act of deep medical wisdom. She was insisting he remain a person rather than a number. She would become, over the coming months, one of his most trusted guides, holding a mirror up to his identity at moments when he couldn't see himself clearly. The diagnosis shifted everything. Paul writes about illness not as an epiphany, not as some clarifying burst of light that suddenly reveals what truly matters, but as a firebomb on the path forward. The future he had built, year by painstaking year, simply ceased to exist. And in its place was a vast uncertainty. He might have months. He might have years. Nobody could tell him. He describes trying to navigate this uncertainty with something that feels both very human and very funny in its frustration. Tell me 3 months, he thinks, and I'll focus entirely on family. Tell me 1 year and I'll write a book. Give me 10 years and I'll go back to medicine. But nobody would give him a number. And so the question of how to spend his remaining time became almost paralyzing, because you can't optimize an equation when you don't know its key variable. Part of what makes this book so remarkable is how Paul's perspective keeps shifting between physician and patient, and how disorienting that shift is. One day he's reviewing a case in the operating room. The next is the one in the gown, unable to get out of bed without a cane. As a neurosurgeon, he understood better than most what cancer spreading to the brain would eventually mean. He had watched his own patients go through exactly this. He had sat with their families and explained what the scans showed. Now he was the one waiting for results. There's a particular kind of loneliness in that position that Paul describes without self-pity. The loneliness of knowing too much about what's coming. Of being fluent in a language that only makes the terror more precise. Yet something surprising happened. After months of recovery, of adjusting to his new medications, of slowly regaining some strength, Paul made a decision. He wanted to return to the operating room. Not because he had to, but because surgery was where he felt most fully himself. It was the place where his skills, his values, and his relationship with meaning all converged. His department chairman was moved. His co-residents quietly rallied around him. And so, one morning, Paul put on a shirt and tie. He had returned all his scrubs months earlier, assuming he was done, arrived at Stanford, changed back into the familiar blue, and picked up a scalpel for the first time in 18 weeks. His first case back, his vision dimmed at the table. He stepped away, sat down, sipped orange juice, and told himself tomorrow would be better. It was. And the day after that was better still. There is something almost unbearably moving about Paul Kalanithi returning to the operating room while dying. It wasn't bravado. It wasn't denial. It was something more interesting, a deliberate choice to inhabit the self he had worked his whole life to become, for whatever time remained. He writes about coming back not as a hero, but as someone slowly rebuilding his fluency. He had to relearn tricks his hands once knew instinctively. There was a day he stared at a bulging disc in a patient's spine for 20 minutes, unable to remember his preferred technique, and then, suddenly, it came back. His muscle memory, once restored, was extraordinary. What Paul comes to understand during this period is one of the book's most important insights, that meaning isn't something you find at the end or in the grand moments. It lives in the work. It lives in the relationships. It lives in showing up. For him, returning to surgery wasn't a performance of courage. It was a way of staying connected to the thing that had always made his life feel worth living. But the tricky thing about living with terminal illness, and Paul is bracingly honest about this, is that your values don't stay fixed. They keep changing. You think you've figured out what matters most, and then 2 months later you feel differently. He describes traversing the classic 5 stages of grief completely out of order. He accepted his death first, on diagnosis. Then came depression. Then something like bargaining. Then flashes of anger. And finally, something he calls total denial, a kind of shrug that says, in the absence of certainty, maybe we just assume we'll live a long time. One of the threads that runs quietly through this section of the book is the question of Lucy and what their marriage meant. Before the diagnosis, it was fraying. The grinding pressure of residency had pushed them apart in ways neither of them had fully named. The cancer, Paul writes, was like a nutcracker, cracking open the shell to get back to the soft nourishment inside. They rediscovered each other. They held hands constantly, in Paul's coat pocket on cold walks after chemotherapy. Lucy threw herself into tracking every aspect of his care with the precision of a physician and the ferocity of a wife. And then they made a decision that some people find astonishing. They decided to have a child. Paul would not live to see his daughter grow up. They both knew that. But Paul didn't believe that the value of a relationship was measured by its duration. He believed that love and life could be real and full even within the narrowest of windows. Their daughter, Cady, was born in the final months of Paul's life. He describes holding her with a kind of quiet, aching wonder, a joy he writes was entirely unlike anything he had felt before. Not frantic, not desperate, just full. Around this same time, he also made another decision. He would write a book. He had always meant to. Literature had been his first love, and he had always imagined returning to it someday, some far-off, unhurried future day. Now that day had arrived, and it was neither far off nor unhurried. He started writing in the chair in his living room, often with Cady in his lap, using voice dictation software when his hands became too weak for the keyboard. The book you're hearing tonight is that book. He knew, as he wrote, that he might not finish it. And in fact he didn't, not entirely. The final chapters feel like they were written by someone who understood that the sentences were running out. There is a remarkable passage near the end where Paul reflects on time itself. Time, he writes, has changed shape for him. It no longer feels like a ticking clock, more like a state of being. He is no longer oriented toward a future. Medical training, he observes, is all about delayed gratification, all about picturing yourself 5 years from now. And now he genuinely doesn't know where he'll be in 5 years. Or if. He writes a letter, of sorts, to Cady. He can't know who she will be when she reads it, he says. He doesn't know if she'll like the nickname they've given her. But he knows one thing he wants to tell her. That she filled his last days with a joy unlike anything he had known in all his years before. A joy that doesn't hunger for more, that doesn't grasp. Just rests, satisfied. Then Paul stopped writing. He died on March 9, 2015. He was 37 years old. His wife Lucy completed the epilogue of the book he left behind. Lucy's epilogue is brief, and it is devastating. She describes Paul's final days, the fever, the emergency room trip, the BiPAP mask that helped him breathe, the moment when the family had to face whether to put him on a ventilator or let him go. Paul, even in those last hours, was thinking like a physician. He asked the team what his real chances were of meaningful recovery. When it became clear the odds were very small, he asked for Cady. She was brought in, nestled in the crook of his arm, tugging at her tiny socks, smiling, completely unbothered by the machinery keeping her father alive. And then, holding his daughter, Paul said goodbye to the mask. Lucy writes that the most beautiful version of Paul she ever knew was the one who wrote this book, frail but never weak. She describes his wicked sense of humor that doesn't quite make it onto these pages. His tenderness. His fierce insistence on securing her future even while navigating the end of his own life. And she ends with something that feels less like an ending than a continuation. These years, she writes, the most wrenching years of her life, were also the most beautiful and profound she has ever known. It is an extraordinary close to an extraordinary book. One of the things this book reveals that no clinical text ever could is what it feels like to cross from one side of medicine to the other. Paul spent years being the person who read the scans, who delivered the news, who made the call. He was trained to solve, to fix, to optimize. And then, suddenly, he became the chart on the wall. The person the doctors spoke about in the hallway. The case. He writes about how disorienting that transition was, not just emotionally, but intellectually. He knew too much. He knew exactly what the imaging meant, what the statistics said, what the language of his own medical reports was quietly communicating. Most patients receive their diagnoses in a fog of unfamiliar words. Paul received his imperfect, terrible clarity. His knowledge didn't protect him. In some ways it made everything harder. And yet it also gave him something. He could speak to his oncologist as a peer. He could push back on treatment decisions. He could read his own labs at midnight and understand them. He moved through the medical system not as someone swept along by it, but as someone who had built it, who understood its rhythms and its silences. That inside of you, the physician watching himself be treated as a patient, is one of the things that makes this book singular. No one else could have written it, because no one else occupied both chairs at once. Now, for the honest part. When Breath Becomes Air is one of the most beautiful books published in this century. But it's not without its limitations, and the ones that exist are worth naming, not to diminish it, but because reading honestly is a form of respect. The book is unfinished. Paul died before he could complete it. The final sections feel like they were written against the clock, because they were. There is something slightly rushed in the last 20 pages, a narrowing of scope, a sense that the ending came sooner than the story was ready for. This isn't a criticism of Paul. It's simply the truth of the circumstances. There is also a certain intellectual density to Paul's voice that some readers find distancing. He quotes poets and philosophers throughout. His references are genuine. This was a man who had truly read and loved all of these people. But they can create a gap between reader and narrator, a feeling that you're watching a brilliant mind think rather than sitting beside a frightened one suffering. And finally, the book is almost entirely Paul's perspective. Lucy is present but partial. We see her through Paul's eyes, devoted, steady, heartbroken. Her own inner life, her own grief and love, exist largely in the margins until she writes the epilogue. She wrote beautifully there about wanting the world to know that Paul was surrounded by love, that his story was not solitary, even if his voice in the book reads that way. None of these things make it a lesser book. They make it a human one. So what do you carry with you into sleep tonight? Maybe it's this. Paul Kalanithi spent years becoming one of the finest neurosurgeons in the country. And in the end, what he most wanted to leave behind wasn't a research paper or a surgical technique. It was a book. Words. A conversation with people he would never meet, about questions he had spent his whole life chasing. He wrote about the strange gift that dying gave him, not the cliché gift of perspective that gets mentioned in greeting cards, but something quieter and stranger. A kind of present tense living that most of us only access in small flashes. The way a moment with his daughter in his arms felt complete in itself, not a stepping stone toward something else. Most of us spend most of our days in the future, planning for next week, next year, a life that is always just around the corner. Paul was forced into the present, and what he found there surprised him. Not despair, not rage, something closer to a deep, satisfied aliveness. A joy that, as he put it, does not hunger for more and more, but simply rests. You don't have to be dying to practice that. You just have to remember, every now and then, that this moment, this breath, this weight of your body against your mattress, this quiet, is not the rehearsal. It's the thing itself. Sleep well. And we'll see you at Whispering Pages for the next one.